Why Buddha says letting go of sex is the most skillful thing? In life, we often become attached to desires and cravings, believing they are essential to our happiness. However, the Buddha teaches us that true peace comes not from indulging in our desires, but from letting go of them. Particularly, he highlights that letting go of our attachment to sex is one of the most skillful things we can do. As we journey through life, it's natural to experience desires, but we must learn to recognize the damage that attachment to these desires causes. The Buddha's final teachings were a call to awaken, to be vigilant and avoid complacency in our thoughts and actions. So why does the Buddha say that letting go of sex is a key to skillful living? Let's reflect on this deeply. Understanding the role of attachment. In the vast expanse of human experience, there is one constant truth that the Buddha illuminated with profound clarity. Our suffering is often born from attachment. It is not just the attachment to material things, wealth or status, but also to emotions, desires, and even our very sense of self. The more we cling to these things, the more we bind ourselves to the wheel of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The Buddha teaches that we are not meant to cling. We are meant to experience life fully and freely, without the heavy burden of attachment weighing us down. The nature of attachment is such that it distorts our perception, causing us to see things as permanent, when in fact they are impermanent. This is the core illusion that we live under, believing that things will bring us lasting happiness. When we grasp onto a particular desire, be it for success, love, or pleasure, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. This is especially true for sexual desire, which often becomes a dominant force in our lives. The Buddha recognized that sexual desire, much like all other desires, stems from the belief that it will bring fulfillment. Yet, this fulfillment is always temporary. The pleasure derived from sexual experiences, while intense, is fleeting. It comes, it goes, and with it, the sense of satisfaction fades, leaving behind longing and dissatisfaction. In the pursuit of this fleeting pleasure, we often lose sight of the more profound and lasting peace that lies within us. The Buddha's teachings encourage us to examine this attachment to pleasure, whether it be sexual, material, or emotional, as a way of understanding the deeper workings of our minds. Just as the wind sweeps through the trees, leaving no trace, so too should our desires pass through us without leaving a mark. When we allow ourselves to become attached, we create friction within our minds and hearts, leading to a constant cycle of longing and unfulfilled desire. It's important to understand that the problem is not the desire itself, but our attachment to it. Desires, in and of themselves, are natural. They arise within us as part of our human experience. But when we attach to them, when we believe they define us or hold the key to our happiness, we are entering into a cycle that will never bring true peace. The Buddha's message here is clear. Attachment is the cause of our suffering, and letting go of attachment is the key to liberation. There is a beautiful story from the Buddha's life that perfectly encapsulates this principle. It is said that the Buddha, after attaining enlightenment, was once approached by a young woman named Ambapali. She was a beautiful and wealthy courtesan, and she had fallen in love with the Buddha. Ambapali invited him to her home, offering him a seat of honor and all the comforts she could provide. However, the Buddha, seeing through the transient nature of material wealth and sensual pleasure, humbly declined her invitation. In that moment, Ambapali realized something profound. True happiness does not come from external sources. It comes from within. She understood that her attachment to worldly pleasures was the source of her unhappiness, and she, too, would begin the path of liberation. Through this story, we see that even in the face of beauty, wealth, and sensual pleasure, the Buddha remained unaffected. His attachment was not to the fleeting moments of pleasure, but to the eternal peace found in mindfulness, meditation, and detachment. He showed that true freedom lies not in the pursuit of transient pleasures, but in the cultivation of inner peace and wisdom. When we learn to let go of attachment, especially to desires that promise fleeting pleasure but never deliver lasting happiness, we open ourselves to a deeper, more enduring joy. The Buddha teaches us that by observing our desires without clinging to them, we free ourselves from the suffering that comes with attachment. In doing so, we create space for the true, lasting happiness that comes from a heart free of clinging and a mind clear of distractions. In the practice of mindfulness, we become aware of these attachments as they arise. Rather than being swept away by them, we observe them with compassion and understanding. We do not judge ourselves for feeling desire, but we also do not allow it to dictate our actions. This is the path to freedom, the ability to live in the world, experiencing it fully without being bound by it. Through the teachings of the Buddha, we learn that attachment to anything, whether it is a person, a desire, or a belief, only leads us further from the peace we seek. When we cling to the impermanent, we lose touch with the permanent. When we attach to the passing moments of pleasure, we forget the enduring peace that is available to us in every moment. The path to liberation is not about denying our desires or repressing our feelings. It is about cultivating the wisdom to understand them for what they truly are, temporary, ever-changing, and ultimately unsatisfying when clung to. By practicing mindfulness, we begin to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. And in that seeing, we find freedom. Freedom from suffering, freedom from attachment, and freedom to experience life in its true, unencumbered form. The 5 aggregates, khandhas, and their role in suffering. In the teachings of the Buddha, our experience of life is not simply a series of unrelated moments, but is shaped by what are known as the 5 aggregates, or khandhas. These 5 components, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, combine to create the fabric of our everyday experience. But while they may seem like the essence of who we are, the Buddha pointed out that these aggregates are not our true selves. They are transient, ever-changing, and impermanent. And yet, we often cling to them, mistaking them for our identity, which is the root of much of our suffering. The Buddha teaches that the moment we attach to these aggregates, we fall into the trap of ego. Our minds begin to identify with the physical form, our body, the feelings we experience, pleasure, pain, sorrow, our perceptions of the world around us, and the mental formations that create the narratives of our lives. But these elements are not fixed or permanent. They arise, change, and fade away, and yet we grasp onto them as though they define who we are. This attachment to the aggregates, particularly to our sense of self, leads to suffering. One of the key aggregates, feeling, Vedana, plays a particularly significant role in our attachment to desires, such as sexual desire. Sexual desire, like all forms of craving, arises from a feeling, a pleasant sensation that we seek to prolong. When we experience pleasure, our minds become fixated on it, creating a desire to capture that feeling and hold on to it. We build a sense of self around this feeling, thinking, I am this pleasure, or this pleasure is who I am. The Buddha, however, invites us to question this identification. What we fail to realize is that these feelings, whether pleasurable or painful, are simply fleeting phenomena. They arise and dissolve in the mind like waves on the surface of a pond. When we grasp at these feelings, we suffer. This is the essence of dukkha, suffering caused by clinging to things that are impermanent. To further understand this, let's reflect on an ancient Buddhist story. It is said that a young monk once approached his teacher, troubled by the overwhelming desires he felt. The teacher, a wise elder, instructed him to sit by a river and observe the flow of water. Notice how the water moves, always changing, never staying the same. Similarly, your desires come and go. Do not hold on to them as you would grasp at the flowing water. Let them pass through you, and they will lose their power over you. The young monk meditated on this teaching, and over time, he learned to let go of his attachment to fleeting desires, including his sexual cravings. He understood that by identifying with these transient feelings, he was only prolonging his own suffering. As the teacher had said, true freedom came not from resisting these feelings, but from recognizing them as temporary and not a true part of himself. The second aggregate, mental formations, sankhara, is also critical in shaping our experiences, especially when it comes to sexual desire. These formations are the mental constructs, thoughts, habits, and patterns of behavior that we cultivate over time. When we experience desire, our minds often construct elaborate narratives about it. We may convince ourselves that satisfying this desire will bring happiness or fulfillment. However, these mental formations are often based on delusion, as they are rooted in the mistaken belief that pleasure will provide lasting satisfaction. The Buddha's wisdom lies in teaching us to observe these mental formations with equanimity. By practicing mindfulness, we learn to watch these thoughts and desires arise without identifying with them. We see them for what they are, temporary mental events that come and go. When we cease to identify with these desires, they lose their grip on us. Take, for example, the story of the Buddha's own experience with temptation. After attaining enlightenment, the Buddha was approached by Mara, the tempter, who sought to distract him with worldly pleasures, including the allure of beautiful women. Mara attempted to provoke desire in the Buddha, but the Buddha remained unmoved. He saw the fleeting nature of these temptations and recognized them as merely mental formations, passing thoughts that did not define him. He did not resist them, nor did he act on them. Instead, he observed them with a mind of wisdom, and in doing so, he remained free from their influence. This story illustrates the Buddha's teachings on the importance of observing mental formations without clinging to them. Sexual desire, like any other mental formation, arises in the mind. But when we understand that these thoughts do not define us, we are no longer enslaved by them. Now, the aggregate of perception, samjhana, also plays a significant role in how we relate to our desires. Perception is the process by which we interpret the world around us. It is through perception that we label something as desirable or undesirable. When it comes to sexual desire, our perceptions can often be clouded by societal conditioning or personal attachments. We may perceive pleasure as the ultimate goal, believing that it will lead to lasting happiness. However, the Buddha teaches us that our perceptions are distorted by our desires, and this distorted perception leads to suffering. In the Buddha's time, there was a story of a man who saw a beautiful woman and immediately became infatuated with her. He perceived her as the source of his happiness and imagined that being with her would bring him fulfillment. However, after spending time with her, he found himself dissatisfied as she was not the perfect image he had created in his mind. This story serves as a reminder that our perceptions are often unreliable and that attachment to them leads only to disappointment. The final aggregate, consciousness, vijnana, is the awareness that perceives all of these experiences. Consciousness is the foundation upon which all other aggregates arise, but it is also the source of our attachment. When we identify with our consciousness, we believe that we are the sum of our experiences, our feelings, our thoughts, our perceptions. But this identification leads to suffering, for our consciousness is ever-changing, subject to the impermanence of all things. The Buddha's insight into consciousness teaches us that true freedom comes when we no longer identify with our thoughts and desires. By cultivating mindfulness and meditation, we learn to witness our consciousness without becoming attached to it. This is the path to liberation, seeing the aggregates for what they truly are, impermanent, fleeting, and not worth clinging to. In conclusion, the Buddha's teachings on the 5 aggregates offer us profound wisdom on how to approach our desires, particularly sexual desire. By understanding the impermanent nature of the aggregates and observing them without attachment, we free ourselves from suffering. The aggregates are not who we are. They are temporary phenomena that arise and pass away. True liberation comes when we recognize this truth and stop clinging to them, especially when they create the illusion of self. When we let go of these attachments, we experience the peace that comes with freedom from suffering. The path to freedom. The path to freedom, as laid out by the Buddha, begins with a fundamental understanding. We are the architects of our own experiences. Every moment of our lives is shaped by the choices we make, the thoughts we entertain, and the actions we take. To walk the path of liberation, the first step is becoming acutely aware of this process, acknowledging that we are constantly, actively participating in the creation of our own reality. This awareness is the bedrock of mindfulness, a practice that allows us to see the interconnectedness of our thoughts, words, and deeds, and their cumulative impact on our lives. The Buddha's wisdom lies not just in understanding that we shape our experiences, but in recognizing how much of our suffering stems from unconscious habits, thoughts, and desires that arise without our awareness, dictating our lives. When we are heedless, we are trapped in patterns of craving, clinging, and attachment, often without even realizing it. By cultivating mindfulness, we begin to see how these mental habits form the structure of our suffering. Take, for example, our attachment to sexual desire. The Buddha did not teach that desire itself is inherently wrong, or that we should repress our natural impulses. Rather, he pointed out that attachment to any desire, whether it be sexual or otherwise, leads us down a path of suffering. This attachment is rooted in the illusion that these desires can bring us lasting happiness or fulfillment. However, as we all know, the pleasures of the senses are fleeting, and the satisfaction they provide is always temporary. When we believe that fulfilling these desires will bring us lasting peace, we are deceiving ourselves. The Buddha's call is not to repress our desires, but to transcend the belief that they define us or provide lasting contentment. In one of the Buddha's famous teachings, he compares life to a traveler passing through a burning village. The traveler does not stop to admire the burning houses or to gather possessions. Instead, they focus on finding a way out of the fire. Similarly, when we find ourselves caught in the cycle of craving and attachment, we must not stop and linger, but recognize the fire of desire for what it is, a temporary illusion that will not provide true peace. The Buddha's path is one of liberation through mindfulness, and in the context of sexual desire, this means living with awareness of how these desires arise within us. By observing them without identification, we break the cycle of attachment and craving. We recognize that while desire itself is natural, the suffering comes from our clinging to it. When we let go of the belief that sexual pleasure or attachment will provide lasting fulfillment, we open the door to deeper forms of happiness, those that come from within, not from external objects or fleeting experiences. There is a beautiful story in the Buddhist tradition of a monk who was deeply troubled by his sexual desires. He sought the advice of his teacher, who instructed him to meditate by a river. The teacher told him to watch the water flowing by, always changing, never the same. Just as the water flows and changes, so too do your desires, the teacher explained. Do not hold on to them, let them flow through you. The monk meditated deeply on this teaching, and over time, he came to understand that his desires were like the flowing river, ever-changing, never permanent. By simply observing them without clinging, he was able to transcend them and find inner peace. This story illustrates an essential Buddhist principle. Our desires do not have to define us. We can acknowledge them, observe them, and let them pass without being caught in their grasp. In doing so, we step into a life of greater freedom. Freedom from the constant cycle of craving and disappointment, and freedom to live with clarity and purpose. Living with mindfulness is not about denying or rejecting any part of our humanity. It is about understanding the impermanent nature of all things, including our desires. The Buddha's path invites us to transcend the need for external validation, whether through sexual pleasure, material wealth, or emotional attachment. By cultivating mindfulness, we can see the impermanence of all things clearly, and in doing so, we are no longer bound by them. Instead of seeking fulfillment outside of ourselves, we begin to cultivate a deeper sense of contentment that arises from within. In another teaching, the Buddha described the way to freedom as the practice of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, the Noble Eightfold Path. This path is not a set of rigid rules, but a guide to living skillfully and with awareness. It is through this path that we learn to transform our desires into wisdom and compassion, recognizing them as part of our human experience, but not as the foundation of our happiness. Take, for example, the story of a young man who sought happiness through relationships and the pursuit of sensual pleasures. He was constantly chasing after the next thrill, convinced that it would bring him lasting satisfaction. Yet, no matter how many relationships he had or how many pleasures he indulged in, he was left feeling empty and unfulfilled. One day, he met a wise teacher who taught him the Buddhist practice of mindfulness. As he learned to observe his desires without being controlled by them, he began to see them for what they were, temporary and impermanent. Over time, he realized that true happiness did not lie in external sources, but in the peace and clarity that arose from within him. This story exemplifies the Buddha's teaching. True freedom and fulfillment come when we cease to identify with our desires and attachments. By letting go of the need for external validation and the belief that pleasure can provide lasting happiness, we open ourselves to the deeper, more enduring joy that comes from within. In doing so, we live in accordance with our true nature, a nature that is peaceful, wise, and compassionate. Ultimately, the path to freedom is not about denying our desires, but about recognizing them for what they are: temporary, fleeting, and not the source of lasting happiness. When we approach life with mindfulness and awareness, we are able to see the impermanence of all things, including our desires. We learn to let go of attachment, allowing us to live with greater clarity, wisdom, and peace. In doing so, we transcend the cycle of craving and suffering and step onto the path of true liberation. A story of mindful living. There is a story often shared in Buddhist teachings that reflects the universal struggle many of us face in our search for happiness. It begins with a young person, much like any of us, who believed that happiness was something to be found in the world, through relationships, through experiences, through the fleeting pleasures of the senses. At first, this pursuit seemed to fulfill them. The laughter, the thrill, the connection, all felt so alive, so vivid. Yet, as time passed, something changed. The joy that once seemed endless began to fade, and the more they sought pleasure, the emptier they felt inside. The excitement of one relationship was replaced by the need for another, and the satisfaction of a momentary indulgence left them wanting more, each time with less fulfillment. Consider another story from the Buddha's own life, when Mara, the tempter, sought to disturb the Buddha's meditation. Mara sent forth his daughters to tempt the Buddha with pleasures of the senses, yet the Buddha remained unmoved. He recognized these pleasures as nothing more than fleeting sensations, impermanent and empty, and he did not cling to them. Instead, he focused his mind on the wisdom of the present moment. As a result, Mara's temptations lost their power, and the Buddha attained enlightenment. In this way, the Buddha showed us that the true path to freedom lies not in the avoidance of desire, but in the wisdom to see through it. When we stop clinging to external pleasures as a source of fulfillment, we discover that the peace and happiness we seek have always been within us. It is through mindfulness and letting go of attachment that we free ourselves from the cycles of craving and dissatisfaction. Through the practice of mindfulness, we learn to live in harmony with our desires without allowing them to define us. We can observe them, let them rise and fall, and move through life without being controlled by them. This is the path to true freedom, the freedom to live with clarity, to experience life fully, without being bound by the impermanent, the transient, and the fleeting. Just as the young person in the story learned, when we turn inward and let go of the attachment to external sources of happiness, we open ourselves to the stillness and joy that transcend all desires. The Buddha's path teaches us that happiness is not something we find outside of ourselves, but something we cultivate within through mindfulness, awareness, and letting go of the need for external validation. And so, as we walk the path of life, let us remember this teaching. The true source of happiness lies not in what we cling to, but in what we are willing to let go. Letting go of the ego. One of the most profound aspects of the Buddha's teaching is the recognition that our sense of self, this constant, ever-present I, is often the very thing that holds us back from spiritual growth. The sense of I that clings to desires, experiences, possessions, and even identities is the root of much of our suffering. It is this sense of self that gives rise to attachment, pride, jealousy, and fear, emotions that keep us chained to the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, or samsara. The Buddha did not tell us to eliminate our sense of self entirely, but instead to recognize the false nature of the self that we create through attachment. The self we cling to is not permanent. It is a construct, an illusion. It is shaped by our desires, our experiences, and the labels we assign to ourselves and others. This false sense of I causes us to identify too strongly with the transient, the impermanent, and the fleeting aspects of life. It makes us believe that we are separate from the world, from others, and even from the universe itself. One of the Buddha's most famous teachings is the doctrine of anatman, or the non-self. He teaches that there is no permanent, unchanging self. Instead, we are all a collection of ever-changing physical and mental states. Our body, our thoughts, our feelings, they are all part of a constant process of change. And yet, we tend to cling to the idea of a fixed I, a permanent identity that we believe is real and unchanging. This attachment to the self leads to suffering because it keeps us from seeing the truth of impermanence and interdependence. Consider the story of the great Buddhist teacher, Angulimala. Angulimala was once a feared bandit, known for his ruthless nature and violent deeds. He had collected the fingers of his victims as trophies, earning him the name Angulimala, meaning garland of fingers. But one day, he encountered the Buddha while on a killing spree. The Buddha, seeing the deep suffering in Angulimala's heart, approached him with compassion. "Angulimala, I am not running away from you." The Buddha said, "I am standing still, and it is you who are running." Angulimala was struck by the Buddha's calm, and over time, he realized that his sense of self, the identity he had built around his violence and fear, was not who he truly was. Through the Buddha's teachings, he began to see that his actions were rooted in a false sense of self, one that could be transcended. Eventually, Angulimala renounced his violent ways, became a monk, and attained enlightenment. This story demonstrates the transformative power of letting go of the false self, of shedding the layers of attachment that define us, and moving toward the peace that comes from realizing our true nature. The Buddha's teaching on letting go of the ego does not mean we must abandon our sense of identity or lose our individuality. Instead, it encourages us to cultivate a more skillful, responsible sense of self, one that is rooted in mindfulness, compassion, and virtue. When we recognize the impermanence of all things, including our identity, we can live more freely, without clinging to the idea of a fixed self that dictates how we should act or what we should desire. In a more contemporary sense, this can be seen in the way we relate to our roles in society, our achievements, and even our flaws. Many of us identify ourselves through our jobs, our relationships, or our past accomplishments. But the Buddha teaches us that these are not the essence of who we truly are. These external identities are impermanent, and if we cling too tightly to them, they become sources of suffering. We might fear losing our job, our status, or our loved ones because we have built our sense of self around these things. But when we realize that these roles and labels are temporary and ever-changing, we can let go of the attachment to them and experience freedom. There is also the story of the monk who had been practicing meditation for years, but felt trapped by his ego. No matter how much he meditated, he couldn't seem to let go of his pride and sense of superiority. One day, while traveling through the forest, he encountered an old woman who asked him, "What is the essence of your meditation?" The monk proudly responded, "I meditate to find enlightenment, to escape the suffering of the world." The old woman smiled and replied, "Then let me ask you, if you are seeking freedom, why are you still holding on to the chains of pride?" The monk was taken aback. He had been so focused on his meditation practice that he had not realized that the true obstacle to his freedom was his attachment to his own ego. He was clinging to the idea that he was special or better than others because of his spiritual practice. Through this realization, he finally let go of the false sense of self that had been blocking his enlightenment. This story shows us that letting go of the ego is not a rejection of ourselves, but a liberation from the false identities we create. In the Buddhist teachings, letting go of the ego is not a call to destroy our individuality or to become passive. It is a call to awaken to the truth of who we are, a truth that is not defined by our fleeting desires, our temporary identities, or the labels we wear. It is a recognition that the essence of who we are is boundless, interconnected, and ever-present, beyond the small, self-centered I that we cling to. The path to letting go of the ego is one of mindfulness, self-reflection, and compassion. By observing our thoughts and actions with awareness, we begin to recognize when we are acting from a place of ego, when we are clinging to a false identity. Through mindfulness, we can let go of these attachments, cultivating a deeper sense of peace and contentment. We begin to see that we are not separate from others, but interconnected, part of a larger whole. Ultimately, the Buddha's teaching on the ego invites us to embrace the truth of impermanence and interdependence. When we stop clinging to our self-created identities, we open ourselves to the freedom that comes from letting go of the false self. This liberation is not just for ourselves, it is for the world around us as we cultivate a more harmonious relationship with all beings. The more we let go of the ego, the more we are able to act with wisdom, compassion, and love, creating a life that is truly free. As we grow older, we may find that letting go becomes more natural. The burdens of attachment and desire that once seemed essential to our happiness become lighter. The Buddha's teachings offer us a path to peace, a way of living that transcends the fleeting pleasures of life, including the attachment to sex. When we practice mindfulness, when we are aware of the impermanence of all things, we learn to release our hold on desires that no longer serve us. By letting go of sex and the attachments tied to it, we open ourselves to a deeper, more profound connection with life itself. In doing so, we follow the Buddha's call to live skillfully, free from the weight of desire and fully immersed in the present moment. So, let us ask ourselves, what attachments am I holding on to? And with compassion and mindfulness, can I begin to let go, creating space for true peace and liberation?